we have this beautiful image with just an amazing perspective. We're deep down in there with the flowers. Just pointing out, I really want to go for a composition on my sketchbook. I am going to stay smaller format and hopefully be able to finish during the session, as I will try to do, as I visualize now, maybe 2, probably could do 3. I don't know if I would have time to do that in a 2-hour session. But first thing, I'm going to add a little frame, just as I have been doing on most of the pages in this sketchbook, just to keep a little more consistency. And it's going to be very simple. As usual, the plan to somehow stay in the mindset. I was just saying that you must find the mindset of playground, child's play, staying abstract, non-verbal, not naming, just color mixing, playing with your technique, taking chances, making experiments, looking for that looseness in the drawing, looking for the looseness in the brush stroke, maybe even looking for the looseness with the color harmonies. There is such thing. You could experiment with all and every single one of them. So I have a decision to make here. And I think I probably am going to want to do that. This is just too much fun. So if I could work on 3 versions, and again, I may only get to 2, but the sketchbook, the image and the sketchbook lend themselves to doing something like this today. So it's something for the composition of a page. There I am. I'm playing with a little bit of looseness in my composition. Or there are many artists that actually would break up the composition of one single image into different sections of the image, allowing yourself to make the frame part of your work. So I hope this works. I am basically going to try simple things. So as I work on one, I'm going to allow it to dry. I'm really going to go for that wet on wet technique today, where I must allow time for that magic moment. As I mix my paints and wait, I could also be working on a second and maybe even a third, but I do want to play with a little bit of variation in the mediums. So looking ahead, I have ink pens, I have obviously my brushes, pencil. I'm also bringing in some color pencils, just have them ready. I also have those watercolor pencils, and I have many other tools like water-soluble inks. I'm not sure if at this format, so small, this would work. It may be better after the fact. So what kind of techniques could I use? Start with the simple one, which would be just pencil and watercolor. And then my question would be, well, if I have a triptych of the same image, or I could play with variations of that image, which should be the lightest or heaviest, and how should I compose those? Will they're not going to be the same, obviously they're all going to be watercolor, but one's going to have maybe pencil lines, one probably won't have pencil lines, one will have ink lines. How should I distribute? How should I organize them? And I have a feeling I'm going to want my traditional pencil line and watercolor in this middle. And I'm going to start once again with lots of blind drawing. Just made a decision here, sorry. This will be my pencil watercolor. This one, I am going to watercolor with no pencil lines. And then make the decision if I need additional mixed media such as color pencil or gouache or anything else. And this will be my ink. So we'll start over here. And it's going to be a very light, just a very light drawing. So you may not see this on camera. And I'm doing 100% blind drawing, trying not to add any detail at all, just looking for edges, negative space. Negative space is going to be a big one here in between some of the areas of these petals. And my emphasis is going to be this upper, that big. We have two protagonists, let's call it. This in our foreground and the one right behind it, which also has to deal with a little bit of juxtaposition with this stem here. And I'm going to just hint at it. And we have these beautiful curves in them, which if you notice, you can do line and color work that is going to be, it could be, I mean, I'm talking about curve, light, and I mean light as in light and shadow. Also the lightness and the softness of it. So it could be kind of sensual in terms of all of the way you can actually play with that, with all of those elements. Very, very flowery. And my second one, which is this one here right behind. Everything else is going to be somewhat background, extras in my image. And although it does look like a complex, oh my God, there's so many elements. And there are. You could and should simplify this into the way I'm seeing it, into a major protagonist, the star and the co-star basically. And most of it is pretty much on size here. So you do see some light pencil lines, and I'm going to go ahead and just hint at negative space, because most of the rest of the watercolor work that I will be doing should be, some would call it freehand. It's in that sense of looseness that we're preaching here, where I'm going to be able to take lots a big range of artistic freedom. And I'm already thinking about how am I going to work with some of these blurred. So in terms of background, do I want a background or do I want the color of some of these to really pop and stand out over the white of the paper? And I think I will stick with that. We have a few petals. And again, some of them I don't even have to draw because they're just so... Now they're getting smaller and smaller, but they're also going to be light in terms of value and blurry in terms of sharpness. But it's squinting. In a way, you see element 1, 2, 3, and then you see others kind of, as you squint, take a big, calling for attention. But what's relevant here, the lightness, as they become more and more blurry in the background. And I should repeat, I did most of this drawing, I would say 98, 99 as usual, blind. I did readjust a little bit, squeezed in the composition just a little bit. And some of these petals are going to be so small, they'll probably dry faster, so that's a big plus. And I'm also going to play with some of the color that does get more saturated in some of this background. So juxtaposition and breaking up layers is going to be another part of my strategy here. And as usual, as I recommend, trying to work from the background towards the foreground, you really have to keep some of this foreground in mind. So preserving some of that space or light, in this case, some of that white. It's obviously green, yellow, green, that has lots of light, which will be a low value to make sure you keep that in mind. So doing some lifting if necessary. And there we have it. So colors. We could get right to technique. And again, there's different ways where you could approach this. I'm going with this traditional way, and I want to make sure I have a couple of fun brushes. They are going to be my smaller brushes, but this is a squirrel, natural squirrel, a quill. This is synthetic, my velvet, which I love, and most likely will be great for some of these layers today. And then obviously my sables, which are smaller, the round, which in order to get some of those edges and the wet on wet technique, I will have to make a really crucial decision on which should be the brush to do that. So it could be that one and done, dropping in the paint and letting it do its thing. So for colors, we have very beautiful colors here, and it's going to be kind of simple. You could, and I could use the opposite side of my sketchbook, which is great for some of those color swatches. Let's go ahead and move this here. And I'm going to just, right at the edge. So this is a cobalt violet, right out of the pan, no mixing. And boom, I had a feeling that was going to be it, with tiny variations of maybe saturation, and I'm going for a cool, alizarin crimson. So I'm going to mix just a touch of that. And make a second. And there it is. So in terms of light and temperature, it's going to be about value. You could also play with a little bit of technique on this opposite side here, if you have an area for that, where I'm going to drop in just a little bit of water and actually rehearse. Maybe pre-plan how it's going to work as far as wet on wet. And how I can manage to bring in some of those edges. They are so small, I am going to have to switch brush already. So for these small tests, I do like the light, and I could do a little bit of lifting. So I guess it is a good idea, maybe rehearse some of these. And yep, this is the brush. So I'm using my synthetic. This is called a Black Velvet number 6. You can see that tip. It gives you a really fine, sharp tip. And as far as wet on wet, I want to see how, taking a little bit of time, how it's going to work on wet. I have here some that's already becoming moist, so it could be great for some of those edges. And I'll bring in a little extra. So again, I'm dipping my brush, cleaning it, and just putting it in clean water. And then I'm tapping it on my paper towel, making sure I have a little bit of moisture on the tip. So it's managing that moisture that is going to allow me to soften some of these edges or create that gradation in color, in value. Mix some of the color as well. And see, I'm already getting carried away in my rehearsal when I should be already finishing some of these petals. So I love it. And this is pretty much the look that I'm going to want. So there's a nice little petal. I should, since I'm here, I should mix, and I do have some olive green. I mixed in a little bit of yellow ochre. I don't want it to be, in terms of temperature, it's an interesting one because you have that warm but cool temperature in the petals. Overall, that violet, it's a red violet that is a warm. It leans towards the warm, but there's also this coolness to it, and the word would be balance. It's just like almost a perfect balance of them. So my yellow green, I don't want it to be too cool or too warm. Try to create some sense of balance between that as well. So this is olive green, a touch of yellow ochre, and I did add just a tiny touch of a Hansa yellow. And I'm going to add water to add a little extra light, and there we have it. I think, boom. If I could just bring that over, copy paste, I would do that. But again, all different variations with value, with color that you can play with. You could push away from this color and maybe bring it into a more blue violet. That would be up to you. I'm going to do a small little gradient here with just this color, and I want to see how light. So sort of a 1, 2, 3 in terms of saturation, with even more water to its lightest. And here it's going to look just like water. But the ratio of water pigment is very, very light. And I am going to need some of that as I see it here. We also talked about different techniques, such as, would you see yourself doing some spatter or some salt or some cauliflower in any of these? Yes, then we do that. So, have my brush, have my colors ready, start mixing, and I want to start with number 1, taking a deep breath and remembering, okay, it's about looseness. So how do I get there again? Connect with the image. And with a very light value, I'm just touching spots of color that I see. And I'm hoping to make some of these blurry or first layer in some of these bigger petals. Now these bigger petals, I do want to manage the timing more than anything. Obviously the shape. And it's just like peppered. Just a little peppered color here and there. And I'm trying to squiggle, just almost scumble the brush, as you could see. And without losing too much track of the moisture on the paper, I want to catch it so I could come right back, have a nice little mix of it, and when the timing is right, which should be right here, do a little bit of that wet on wet. Ooh, nice. That's what I was hoping for. So I want these to be very light, very blurry. So I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to soften the edge as it's drying. I'm going to add just a tiny touch of water. So you may see a bit of cauliflower, but it'll be so small. It'll read as texture. And the last thing is, remember when we work with light values, it's going to dry even lighter. It's going to dry 30%, they say, 15 to 20% depending on which pigment. But today's color just turned out to be easy. This cobalt violet. And if you don't have a cobalt violet, well, you just want to lean with a cool red, cool blue, and stay more on the red side of the violet. And make sure you do your color swatches. Now I have a brush. It's a round brush. It's a number 6. And it does give me these amazing drawing qualities of line and almost that beautiful shape that I'm looking for. Not getting carried away. Working. I know it's usually biggest to smallest, lightest, staying as light as possible, as long as possible, but I do want background towards foreground in this one. And I'm really focused on softness of the edge and value simultaneously, and somewhat edge, the blur, but also technique. If we can get away with that one and done process, a lot of it for flowers and petals, it actually works incredibly. It should be the way. Just swipe the brush, create your brush stroke, and then just watch it. Leave it alone. So I have some pencil lines that I'm somewhat following from early on, but the drawing was so loose, it's allowing me to revisit, re-see some of these. So here I have some white that I need to preserve, some paper, and that's going to be tricky. It's that one that I mentioned where we have foreground coming over these light petals. So I don't want this color to show through that light or shadow of my green. It could, so it's going to be cleaner in terms of layer, because I want the lightness of the values to remain close. The one difference may be the sharpness. Maybe a touch in terms of saturation. Now ask yourself, often, am I looking at my reference? When you stop looking at your reference, and you feel comfortable enough to just move on, but realize that you are making up that information. And that's okay, that's totally fine. But I would recommend stay connected. Keep your eye on the reference. Even if you have a drawing, and again, I mentioned I have my pencil lines here, but I want to go back and almost blind, not draw, but blind paint as I'm reconnecting with each one of these parts. And yes, we are focused on many other things as well. I mentioned some of these, it got a little too dry, but we will retouch because they will be layered and having just enough texture on it. It's going to be more about light than texture. Texture, we're going to have more on these two. So I want to pay close attention to this one and make sure I have some of that edge, the pigment, right on the edge. At just the right moment. So if ever you need it to be more meditative, this is it right here. You can really lose yourself in these petals. Zone out. I'm doing a little bit of lifting here. Lifting up just a little moisture, a little bit of color as well to get that translucent look, a little bit of paper coming back through. Drawing the brush fully and doing one last right at the base of those petals. And not rushing this work. You don't want to rush this work. You want to take your time. And again, play with the form, play with the technique, play with the brush. Take your time. I'm going to do the same here, just a little bit of lifting. And it's recommended to have two brushes if you're going to be doing quite a bit of paint and lift, and it's very close or almost feels like you have to do it simultaneously. You could have two brushes, one that's fully dry just for lifting, the other one for painting, so you don't have to so you can make use of that time, which is just a few seconds, but those are crucial seconds. And it's coming along. Let's keep moving. I'm going to let this dry just a little bit as we continue with. There's one that's right next to it. Go back to a little more water. Actually, I'm going to let this edge dry, as I should have worked on this petal and this flower before I did this one as part of the background. So there's one. You don't want these to kind of bleed into each other. So I'll correct that mistake now. It's dry enough that it'll maintain that edge, and I'm hoping I could come back and make it a little sharper, so we could see the difference between the juxtaposition of these two. And then dropping in that pigment. That's the most important thing. How you rehearse and catch that perfect timing for your wet on wet technique to create that beautiful gradient and light and texture of petal. It shouldn't be brushed on. It should be dropped in and almost poured in. Moving along. Going to a little lighter value again, looking for a little more blurriness with the shape, with the edge, but also the light of it. Squinting is your best bet. If you see it in squint mode, you want to try and bring that as close as possible to your paper. Whatever you see while you squint, those edges, those shifts in light and shadow, and I mean light shadow, light and dark, in this case, some of the edges of the petals and such. Here we go. Going right into our star here. So we have some juxtaposition with some elements. They are darker, so I don't have to really worry about coming over later. I am squinting pretty much the whole way through here, really wanting to catch the negative space, the shape of the edges of these petals, and just swipe that brush down. Rearrange some of that water and pigment. And hopefully be ready for that moment. So working my way around, the best way to see this one is through that negative space and the contour. You see those edges? It almost comes together. With little to no effort. That's a good thing. You want that as often as possible. That feeling of you see it, and with a simple brushstroke, effortless gesture, it's captured. I have a really nice negative space here between these two petals. I want to make sure I capture that, and there's a slight shift in thickness. And then a little bit of perspective with petals going backwards and away in the distance. And it is drying already. Drying. So I need to come back and make sure I have my value. If I am going to mix some of that color, as I am touching it with a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. So I have a spectrum of color going there. And before we get too far with it, making sure I can capture that nice wet on wet. Still a little too wet. Still just a degree too wet. But it's at this scale, it could go from wet right through moist to dry in seconds, as it almost did here. So you have to really connect and understand how your technique can be maximized. So not missing that magic moment. And I kind of did here. It really got a little too wet down here, a little too dry, too fast up here. But it's still there. We're seeing it. And now I'll re-wet the brush, play with a little bit of lifting. And that's going to be the easiest way you can bring back that light. So it's also a matter of the staining. Whatever pigment you're using, some of them are a little more staining. The lifting qualities that you can work with, you want to make sure you have that in mind. Some pigments stain a little bit more. There's a big difference in the quality of lifting that you can work with. There we go. So I have a quick pause, going back into my palette, and I'm going to grab some of this green here. And I'm going to start once again with a little blurry, just a little linear, kind of scribbling it on, but I do want to have a plan. I'm not just adding lines anywhere. I want to see them. Some of them, again, become a little more blurry would be the word. There, but not really. You want to just make sure they're light and thin. So I'm going to add a quick line of, and come right back and lift some of it. I'm going to lift even more. So you could almost see that pencil line. And I want to do this in at least 2-3 layers. So you may not be seeing that one right there, this first one. Hoping to keep it somewhat light. Technique-wise, you want a little bit of wet on dry, a little bit of wet on wet. But you also want a little bit of variation, just a little bit of variation in the temperature of that color. So the more neutral green or the more yellow green. And having just a touch of that wet on wet, bringing it together, bringing a little more yellow. So I have, it's a cool yellow, but it's less cool than the lemon yellow or the Hansa yellow. This one is an Aureolin, it's more of a cobalt yellow. So I'm going to put a little bit of that in for this area over here. And when you look at it, it almost looks more white. Like it's a green that's going towards white, not towards yellow, but the temperature is there. So I want to shift that and then bring the value way, way down for this area here. And I do see a shift in it. I'm going to go ahead and use that for the first layer here. Very carefully. And this one, I definitely want to make use of some of the wet on wet with the variation towards neutral. So obviously here you really want to make sure the areas that need to be dry are dry. There we are. Go back into the neutral. And some of these brush strokes are so small and thin, they dry way faster. So I'm just dropping and pouring that paint in, letting it sit, trying to catch a little bit of that shifting light where we have a shadow side and then a light side. Bring some of that shadow up here once again, and we have, this is going to be final stage where we bring some of these sharper edges that are darker as well at the base of the flower. Go back to some of the lighter values. And again, I wanted to do that so I could see it a little bit easier in terms of these back here. I struggled just a bit to see how thin, how light in terms of value, but also the blurriness. Does it have to be? How blurry does it have to be? Which also means, how do you get blurry and thin? It's not easy. The idea would be to work wet on wet and let it blur out, basically. But what I am doing is I'm coming along the side of it, adding a little more water, and trying to create the blur effect without making it too thick. So sweeping up some of that color, bringing in a little more clean water, and just going right along the edge. And it's back and forth, back and forth. So you have a big decision here. We begin to reach that stage where we know we have to go further, but the question will be how far? How many more? And notice the specks of shift and light and value with some of this green. I'm going to do it through layers, and I just did a few here. So if I just layer the same color, and I could add just a little more consistency to my paint, bring up the value, deepen it, a good way to neutralize that color just a little bit is to add that same cobalt violet to that olive green, which gives you sort of a warm brown. You don't want to go too far towards that. You want it to remain in the green. Or obviously to just bring in a cool blue. And then just follow, add the gesture, and literally I'm just drawing them in. So the question of how much detail do you need here or there? It's always a big one. How far do you need to push? How far do you need to go? Where are you satisfied? And I always remind you, less is more. But what does less mean? There's a less that still looks unfinished. So how close to that finished that is not overworked can you? That's the ideal. How do you know when you're done? Most important question you'll be asking today. I'm beginning to add a little more saturation to create a little more space as well between some of these elements. And I think it's working, but it's not working ideal as I wish. I'm going to have to add a little more neutral color to this. So I see maybe more gray, shadowy gray in some of these lower ones down here as they also get distant. So let's go into a little bit of blue. I'm going to use ultramarine with that olive green. Ooh, nice. And let's see how this shift looks here. Yep, it's that gray look, but it's neutral. And I think it worked really, really well. Bring that over to some of these as well. That almost gives it that finishing touch that I was hoping for. As far as my petals, there's a few that I want to maybe retouch just a bit to create that layering of one petal over another. And we have so many more little lines back here, so I'm going to switch to a lower value once again, but I'm happy with this one. This one worked really, really nice. And it almost gives it that, that's as far as I want to know. as I want to go as in terms of finishing touches, the sharpness and the darkness of the value of it. We do have some mixture of elements over here in this area that are don't want to create confusion. Visual, I mean, it makes sense when you see it, but with what we have there, the question, how much more do you need? I do feel like I need some that go just a little bit further into this background here, creating an additional sense of space. And you see some that come here. And now I'm using absolute hair thin lines. But just a little bit of chaos. Not all of it is lines. I'm adding a little more, just, again, peppered. Saturation of color. That same gray, green. And there we have it. That's one that you want to just, at least for now, leave alone. Let it sit. Come back and revisit in a few minutes. So there we are. Do I have time for a second? Yes, we do. So the plan was to do this same thing without the pencil lines, just watercolor drawn. And I don't think there's going to be, you don't barely see the pencil lines here. So I could go a little more careless, more rogue, and do something maybe a little more challenging, a little out of my comfort zone. That could be watercolor first, ink lines. So the plan would be to bring in color, do it more gestural, and then bring ink lines. And I think that would work really well right here. And for this one, I'll do the same, but with pencil lines. So that's a nice way of, you could see it as a study of this portrait of flowers, or this beautiful little landscape, mini landscape. Also interesting the way you would think about it. Do you see it as a portrait? Do you see it as a landscape? I was kind of thinking, for the most part, as a portrait. But down here, definitely, it becomes landscape. I want to add one more little variation of color there. And just a little extra value to some of these down here. This one's a lot deeper and almost going beyond all of the violets we have here, except for the one at the top. So it creates a little more sense of space. And as you can see, a lot of light shadow. It's so, I mean, this is midday with no harsh shadows. The harshest shadows are under our flowers. And what I did was I used that neutral. Try to get it as gray as possible. I'm going to go into my sepia and just add one last one here. 2 and 3. There we go. Before it gets any more saturated or any darker, I think it needed just that little extra touch. And that's it. So I'm going to go with color first, and I'm just going to draw it on. So this is going to be more experimental in a way. I'm trying to create that light value once again. I'm going to start with this big one here. I'm going to do wet on dry with light value, but then I want to really bring out that wet on wet again. So these beautiful petals, and I'm almost mimicking what I just did on the other side. But again, this is all just brush and color. I really love this petal here. Gives this just a great sense of form, kind of completes the form and gives us a little bit of that perspective, the three-dimensionality. There we go. And I'm going to play just a little bit looser since this will be ink lines. I'm going to do a lot of blind, not drawing, painting, dropping in the brush and trying to create a nice gestural. Adding a little extra water, so I'm going to do a little bit of that cauliflower effect in some of these. So a lot more looseness in this last one here. So there's a way to do looseness where it's loose but not too loose. And the joke is Toulouse-Lautrec, too loose. You want to be loose, but it's giving control, but still in control. You are in control because you are giving away control. And that, in a way, it's what they call Zen. Don't quote me on that. It's just the philosophy of how do you let things happen? They're going to happen. Are you in control? What is it that you're trying to do? Understanding how it works. It's going to do something. It is you doing it. But sometimes things happen where you ask, how did I do that? Was it me? That's what I mean. Trying to get more of that. So already I'm liking this. It's more my style, I guess. It almost matches the personality of flowers. They just do what they do. And they do it beautifully. Coming to this last one here, I'm going to, again, pepper some of this cobalt violet down here. And have that juxtaposition play with a few lines of watercolor, but more and more with ink lines. And I will do my third with color pencils. I think it'll work really, really nice because of all the lines. So there we are. Loose, but not too loose. And some of the edges worked really nice. It was also a lot faster, so hoping it wasn't too fast. But that's just a matter of your pace, understanding how you work. Because this is still wet, hoping for some of that wet on wet which gives us these beautiful petal looks. And then obviously I have to let some of these dry. So while I let these dry, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to do third. I'm going to go for it. 3 variations of a theme. And we'll try to see, I'm trying to keep it consistent. This is more playful. With pencil lines, ink lines, color pencil lines, I think it'll make a nice triptych. This one I'm going to try to make even more wet on wet, since we'll be waiting a while for this to dry. And I'm getting more and more familiar with some of these petals, so now it's, yeah, we've been here before. Is there another variation? So once again, managing these edges. I'm going to really showcase this edge that I love right here, this petal. Is it the petal or is it the negative space between the petals that is doing something to me? There we go. And it's also good, it's important for you to pay attention to how you felt on the first one, how you felt. If you're doing variations on a theme, you want to feel how it feels on the first one, how it feels on the second one. I want to come back and retouch this just a little now that I see it on the third one. So you can learn lessons on how it is that it works for you. How do things work for you? Does this feel more comfortable? Oh, this felt really good. So then explore that more. And that's why you would do it. Experiment. Try variations. Going a little bit outside your comfort zone. Something I should have done for this one could have been switching brush. I got a little too comfortable with this brush, and I love it. It worked perfect for these other ones. Do I have to go that far? Well, if there's something in that you're looking for, answers, then yes, you should. If not, totally fine. So these are just coming together beautifully as flowers, and I'm seeing the light. I could see how they're going to work out when they're fully dry. Here, I was trying to be more in control. I could already see where I would have done it differently. And I could still go back and add a few layers. But this is working the way I really enjoy it, the way I like it. Reaching that level of looseness. And it's amazing how that works. I was listening to, I think it was a podcast or something, where they talk about yoga as one of those exercises. And it's any exercise, really, where the idea of it, who likes to run or walk? I mean, of course, you go for a nice walk. But as exercise, you're supposed to enjoy it. But sometimes it pushes the body, the mind, to a level of discomfort. Because it's that when you stay too comfortable, it's not good. But you don't want to get yourself too uncomfortable either. So finding a balance where you can make yourself just a little uncomfortable, where you discover a new feeling or a new level. And it's all about going somewhere new. Or just finding a new path to go to a place you've been before. As you could see here, place we've been before, and there's several different paths. Now, was that more comfortable, more uncomfortable? As you relax and you find that looseness, asking simple questions. Questions about shape, about brush, about value. But it all starts with seeing it. So I hope you're looking closely. You're really maintaining that abstract mind, abstracting the information, breaking it down. I'm also beginning to play with even looser shapes and more editing some of these out and different variations to the edge, while also bringing water and letting that do the work. So, look at that. They look like very close, a little looser. I see the differences. Doing things just a little bit different. Where you could measure just a little bit of a difference in the result. And then understand how it works for you a little bit better. A little bit better each time. You may be asking, wait, was I supposed to be asking questions? Well, whether you know it or not, unconsciously, you were. Every single time you dipped, you mixed paint, you added water to the brush, you brought the paint onto the brush, then you brought it to the paper. Subconsciously, you were asking questions. Okay, is it this way, that way? Pressure, moisture? It's not like you're consciously thinking about them at every step of the way. It begins to happen more and more unconscious. But you are asking those questions, and you are answering. Sometimes you may not be asking the question or answering. You don't know. You just skip the steps right through, which is when you go, oops, why did I do that? You weren't asking the right question. Do you have to be asking those questions? You want to be, again, navigating the trail. You want to be walking it and patiently using what you know, which is why I would also recommend variations on a theme. You hope to learn something new and then catalog, archive that information to be used again and again and again. So here we are, fun part. Going into the green, and I'm just going to draw some of these a little bit lighter. This one seems a little more neutral, less yellow. I love the curve. I'm going to go into yellow ochre again, just a little bit of yellow ochre with a touch of olive green. Saturate that color just a little bit. Use the wet on wet technique. Now, again, the key for some of these, most of these, is knowing when to bring in the next brushstroke, the next technique, according to moisture. So if something's wet that shouldn't be as you're doing this, you want to be careful. And you may be asking, how's he going to do ink lines in here? Yep, I'm going to bring in some very, very light, thin lines to finish up in and around some of this color, which is why I'm keeping it a little bit looser, not too light. I want the color to balance, compete a little bit with the ink lines. So the ink lines I know are powerful and should not just overpower light colors. And it's not going to be lots and lots of them. I could use a few and create a nice visual, a nice balance. Maybe easier with a color pencil as you're thinking, well, these colors and the softness of some of these petals, obviously flower themes. And I'm going to have to let that dry again. So the ink pens that I'll use probably going to be very, very low gauge, meaning very thin. I don't want to use heavy. I could, but it would overpower the softness we have going on here. And for this one, instead of using watercolor, I'll use color pencil. So it kind of looks safe. You want to check it. And I'm going to use a couple of color pencils. Some obvious ones, some not so obvious. So I have all of these. I'm going to show you some cool, some warmer, just cool and darker actually, but also some neutral and all the way to gray. These are just gray. So playing with different variations of these lines. I'm going to be drawing, just drawing them on. And wow, immediately it's a completely different image. Question is it going to work? So I'm going to mix them. I think this is the one. I want this to be soft, once again, soft. I do like the effect. You want to be sure to use color pencil after all of your watercolors done. It's a little tricky, depending on the type of color pencil, to watercolor over oily or waxy color pencils. Doesn't work as well. Sometimes doesn't work at all. But this is back to drawing. So you get to play with color pencil skills and some drawing skills, some mixing and overlapping. Doing a little more of that blurriness. Let's go with a little mix of neutral here. Softer, thinner lines. Obviously you want them to be sharp to the point where you could do every single type of line you need. Hair thin to thicker. And at some point we reach that same place. Well, careful. How much is too much? And once again, most important thing is to make sure it's fully dry before you do any pencil lines. So I could add a couple extra sharp edges to some of these, and it makes more sense. Visually, it's just, let's go back to the neutral. Using the neutral and the soft grays for very, very light color pencil lines back here, creating that blur. And it's a matter of taste. If this doesn't work, not for most people, some people love it. Some people just, nope, doesn't mix. It's just another variation, another one of those. I've seen beautiful, beautiful works that are watercolor, mixed media basically, where you have excellent watercolor showcasing and then finished with color pencil or other types of media. I did mention I have some gouache. And I am going to try that before we finish. I am getting a little carried away with these color pencils. As of right now, I'll stop there. So I do have, this is Artist Gouache. This is the M-gram zinc white. I want to make sure I put it in a place where my palette, where it's not going to mix with my watercolor, or I could get rid of it, clean it up. So safely putting a little bit on my palette, bringing some water, and you absolutely immediately will see the opacity of it. So working with gouache or inks, it's very different than what you do with watercolor here. So I want to make sure I get low value. I'm going to try bringing just a touch of it. Nope, too light. So it's all about opacity. And creating sort of a layer is the way I saw it, where you feels like cheating. You bring in light that you may have not done through value work, but it could do some beautiful things. Let's do some right here as well. And the thicker the gouache, you can literally just paint it right over, and it'll create that type of what I did here, some of these veins, some of these lines on my petal. Let's do a few more over here. It's working really nice. So I hope you could see. If you have a chance to test it, it does enrich. It really does add just a whole new, it's a whole new realm of possibilities. Should have done that here. And the last thing, making sure it's fully dry, I'm going to bring in some ink pens. So I need a 005. I want to go with the smallest one. Here we are. So obviously this needs to be fully dry. And where would I add my ink lines? Well, you saw some of the work I did here with color pencil. Is there anywhere I would love to see a little bit of enhance? I mentioned here saturation under some of the shadows. That's where I'm going to start, where I see a little bit of sharp edge and darker shadow. Oh, nice. That is actually quite nice. And I want to sort of, the key word here is balance it out. One thing enhances the other. So the ink line is there to strengthen the color work. The color work is supposed to hold the ink line. It's not just outlining all of the work I've done. It's choosing where a nice combination of ink lines. Very delicate. Notice that it's not much. Some of it is wet, so I have to stay a little bit. I gotta be careful with some of these, not ruin the pen. Very slowly, doing a little bit of scumbling or parallel hatch or stippling, just dots. It's working really nice. But it does immediately give that finished look. Close to. This is my main one here, but I'm waiting for it to dry just a little bit. Had that wet gouache coming in. And some of these lines could be a variation of a gauge, meaning a little thinner, a little thicker, and they could really work out well. Combinations of elements that were in the background that you want to highlight just enough. And what is it? I'm not sure. It's just, again, contrast. Contrast of media, contrast of sharpness, contrast of value. And it's one of those things you definitely want to practice. Let's go ahead and try it. So this one here may be the one. Very easy to undo work that's already looking great. So it is risky because the ink is just going to overpower any small area. That could be lost forever. So small little choices. Pick small areas. But that is nice. I'm going to switch to just a tiny bit bigger pen. I'm going to add just a touch of stronger and more linear. Let's add just a few. Combination. As if they were in the background. Now, would I want to add color pencil here? Now, you enter a area where, okay, too much seasoning, too much of one thing, or too many things could make you lose that balance. But I'm not saying it doesn't work. Just saying you have to be careful. And I think because we don't have a background, I'm ready to reveal in a 3 variation study, which you cannot deny was a lot of fun.